This is a two-part episode, so I didn't realize it until I recorded it, but it's actually one episode, so enjoy.
Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman. Dun 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 dun. Hey guys, Steveo here from Movies and TVs on the Ball, and this is going to be a part 3, if you will, of a trifecta about Superman. Jay and I have covered both the Smallville pilot, and we've also covered the animated first pilot for the animated TV show that was actually 4 episodes. On this video, I'm going to look at the 90s Superman with none other than Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher as Lois Lane. In 1993 and ended in 1997. It lasted for 4 seasons. And it was directed by Robert Butler, who you may know from with episodes of Remington Steele with the before he was Bond, Pierce Brosnan. He also directed episodes of Hill Street Blues, episodes of Mood Lighting with Bruce Willis, episodes of Star Trek, the original series, The Division as well. He unfortunately tragically died in last year at age 95. So he had a pretty long life and a long career. The pilot was written by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman, and the pilot was written by Deborah Joy Levine. She has written for episodes as the creator of the TV series Courthouse that lasted 11 episodes and was canceled too soon as one season. After one season, she directed episodes of Mental with Chris Vance that lasted one season. So she's had a lot of canceled too soon episode credits. She worked on 2 episodes of Early Edition and Equal Justice. It was also written by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were creators of the Superman film. It's a Superman comic book character. It starred, you had Dean Cain played your Clark Kent. Dean Cain is best known for his roles in Out of Time with Denzel Washington. He showed up in God's Not Dead as Mark Shelley. He was in the Hallmark or Up TV movie A Dog for Christmas and A Dog for Easter. He was in A Bell for Christmas, Small Town Santa, Airplane versus Volcano. He did a couple episodes of Don't Trust the Bee in Apartment 23 as Dean Cain. He was in episodes of Burn Notice. He was in The Dog That Saved Halloween. He was in CSI Miami. And he showed up in both Smallville and the CW television show Supergirl. So he's had a lot of work in DC as Superman. So he's kind of kept with the Superman facade. Then you had Terry Hatcher. Most people know Terry Hatcher from Desperate Housewives in the early 2000s, but her other works include she was a Bond girl in Tomorrow Never Dies. She played Paris Carver. She was in. She did voice work for Coraline. Uh, she was in Planes, Fire, and Rescue, and Planes for Disney. She was in Two and a Half Men. She played Miss Grinko in Spy Kids. That's where I know her from. Episodes of Frasier, episodes of Seinfeld. Um, she was in a movie called All Tied Up, Dead in the Water, and episodes of MacGyver and Tales from the Crypt. And the movie with back in '89 with Kurt Russell and Sylvester Stallone in Tango and Cash. But she's been part of the um, DC lore. She was Lana Lang's mother in Smallville. She played Rhea in Supergirl. And she was in episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, just to name a few. 6 minutes of... Then you had our Lex Luthor. Your Lex Luthor is played by Lane Smith. Now, Lane Smith is pretty much, if you were a 90s kid, you would know him as Coach Riley in the first Mighty Ducks film. He was also did work in the 1984 film. He played Mayor Bates in Red Dawn. He was in the Pauly Shore film Son-in-Law. He was in the film My Cousin Vinny with Joe Pesci. He was in episodes. He did voice work for King of the Hill, episodes of Walker, Texas Ranger. He did The Scout with Brendan Fraser. He was in one episode of Clueless, the TV series. He was in Alfred Hitchcock episodes of Alfred Hitchcock. One episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Hollywood Beat, the 19 TV series V from 84 to 85. Hill Street Blues. And Heart to Heart, to name a few. He was also in episodes of Dallas. And I think that's it. He tragically died about 20 years ago in 2005. But he plays Perry White. And he's a pretty interesting Perry White. He's a little bit no-nonsense Perry White. Someone I've kind of seen a couple... He kind of brings the facade of the Perry White from the Christopher Reeve Superman. Then you had your Jimmy Olsen, played by Michael Landis. Michael Landis is best known for his works in Cruel Summer, the TV series from 2021. He was Thomas Burke in Final Destination 2. He was in. He's recently been in the new Dean of Thieves film that came out this year. He plays a newscaster. He was in The Offer. Angels Has Fallen with Gerard Butler and Morgan Freeman. He did voice work for American Dad. He was in the TV series Stalker. He was in CSI, episodes of CSI. He also did work in Don't Trust the Bee and Apartment 23. He was in the film Burlesque and Lakeview Terrace with Samuel L. Jackson. So he's worked with Samuel L. Jackson twice, or Samuel L. Jackson and Morgan Freeman, excuse me. And he was recently in. He was in Arthur and the King with Mark Wahlberg. It's probably where you've seen him recently. But he plays Jimmy Olsen, and he's a pretty good Jimmy Olsen. He reminded me a little bit of kind of. It's an interesting Jimmy. We'll get into it, but then you had your Lex Luthor, played by John Shea. John Shea is best known for his roles he was in Missing. You probably, if you watch the teen drama Gossip Girl, he played Harold Woodruff. Woodruff. He played a, not in the same, he played Dr. Kurt Connors, not the Lizard, but a guy named Dr. Kurt Connors in episodes of Blue Bloods. He was in episodes of The Blacklist, episodes of Elementary. He was in episodes of Madam Secretary. He was in episodes of Law and Order Criminal Intent, playing two different characters. He was in an X-Men show, Mutant X, and episodes of Sex and the City, to name a few. But he plays our Lex Luthor, and what's surprising about this Lex Luthor is he's not bald in this one. I don't know if John Shea didn't want to shave his head for if he wanted to be if it's later in the series, but I don't know why he didn't shave his head. Then you had the rest of the cast includes Ma and Pa Kent. Martha Kent is played by Kay Callan. Kay Callan is best known for her work, and recently she was in Knives Out. She was in 3 episodes of Veep with Elaine from Seinfeld. She's recently been in Poker Face, episodes of Justified, episodes of How I Met Your Mother, episodes of ER, episodes of Dawson's Creek, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and Quantum Leap, to name a few. She hasn't really done any other movies movies. She's more been a TV actress. More than anything, but she plays Martha Kent, and she's a pretty, what's interesting about this one is both Martha and Pa Kent are alive in this one. I don't think that, and they kind of play it as the old Ma and Pa Kent. But then you had Kat Grant, who she's more of a columnist, columnist of the Daily Planet. She's played by Tracy Scongs, who you pretty much know her from. She played Gilora Raja in one episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. She was in Babylon 5, The Lost Tales. Recently, she was in Castle in 2012, episodes of NCIS, episodes of Nip Tuck, episodes of Felicity. She was in the Highlander TV series, episodes of Wings, episodes of Garfield and Friends. She did voice work for that. She was in. She did voice work for Doll Man versus the Dynamic Toy. And she's been in works for. She was in the TV series Hotel. She's done a lot of TV series. She hasn't done a lot of. She's not done a lot of film. She did work in one episode of Remington Steele as well. So that is your Cat Grant. Then you had Lucy Lane, who is in the pilot. She's played by Elizabeth Barandos. She, you know her from ER and the film Oscar. Her recent works include Badass 2, Badasses. She was in that came to video. She was in Second in Command with Jean-Claude Van Damme in 2006. She was in Maid. She played wife in 2001's Maid. One episode of Judging Amy. She was in Full Body Massage and the movie Night of the Scarecrow with Bruce Glover and John Hawkes. She plays Lucy Lane, and she's only in for about 3 episodes. So that's the gap. Then you have Dr. Platt, played by Kenneth Teeger. Kenneth Teeger is best known as, you probably know him from films such as The Lawyer and Conspiracy Theory. He was in an episode of he was in the film Lethal Weapon 3 as Jarvis Bachner, who worked at the Bomb Squad. She recently did work in episodes of Law and Order SVU. You know him as probably he was also in work as in episodes of Bull, The Good Fight. He did work 15 episodes of The Man in the High Castle. And he did 6 episodes of House of Cards as Walter Dowie. But you probably, if you've seen The Avengers multiple times, you know he is the German old man who stands up to Loki. So that's pretty much where you know him from. And he's kind of the special guest. And then you have Dr. Anita Baines, played by Cam Johnson Lurch, and she has been in. She was in episodes of Passions, the Rumpelstiltskin TV series from 1995. She's been in works in All Rise, Law and Order True Crime. She played Connie, which was about. She was in episodes of Castle, Drop Dead Diva, and episodes of Supernatural, to name a few, and CSI and Third Rock from the Sun. So that's pretty much your cast. Let's get into the episode. So I like how the episode opens. It's a kind of a stormy night, and we see a man kind of entering the Daily Planet. And as he's entering the Daily Planet, we kind of think, okay, this is going to be sort of like a scene where he's going to do, so that we think, the audience thinks that this man is going to do a crime. And then he goes into the he goes in and he walks in and then takes off his mustache, revealing that the man is actually lady reporter woman Lois Lane, who just got done with the scoop. She's just done some insider journalism. And she said, I've got it, I've got the case. And then we should have heard a pop of champagne open because she's now being celebrated for the fact that she did, according to the headline on the paper, $1 million thief ring exposed. And I love the fact that in this daily version of the Daily Planet, there's a lot of different stories about the thief ring, about the $1 million theft ring exposed. There are front pages hung all around the desks of the news and news stories. Around just the area, around the whole office building, and then a news story is about to be played on TV, where TV about the heist, when Perry White shows up and tells him to turn off the TV. Turn off that TV. This is a newspaper, not a celebration place. And he starts kind of barking orders, and this gives the courage for Lois Lane to ask Mr. Perry White for a raise. And the thing is I kind of like how, and we see that. So she goes to try to ask Perry White for a raise. Perry White says, we're running a news station here, and why is everybody standing around here? And then Jimmy, who in this version of Jimmy Olsen, I think he really wants to do more inciting stories, because he tells Perry White about the mini mall murderers, but Perry turns the conversation to Jimmy's column. And I like the fact that he's like, really enthusiastic about, Chief, there was this mini mall murder, and Chief just shuts him down and says, look, Jimmy, you need to do, your basic thing is to do obituaries. And I kind of can tell that Jimmy is sort of wanting to be a little bit more of an exciting reporter like Lois Lane. He asked and I love the fact that Perry asked him, has he finished them? And then he's like, no, I didn't. And then he kind of slunks off. But then Jimmy goes by Lois's desk, and she's typing on the computer. And I kind of like this Jimmy because he's a little bit cooler, a little bit suaver, kind of, in a way. He's not kind of nerdy like he was in the Christopher Reeves films, but he still kind of has a little bit of that kind of boyish charm, a little bit. And so Jimmy ends up, after being rejected by Perry White, he goes over to Lois Lane and says, Lois, what are you working on? And she's typing, and so Lois is typing on the computer, and Jimmy looks on her desk and sees a note about Lex Luthor. And Jimmy is sort of looking at Lois saying, you need to give it up on Lex Luthor. And you need to stop pressing Lex. He does not give anyone an interview. And she's and I love the fact that Lois is very confident and says, your um uh she's confident says, he hasn't met intrepid reporter Lois Lane, and I like how Lois is sort of she's kind of, I think her motivation throughout this pilot, or at least the part beginning of the pilot, is she's so obsessed with wanting to talk to Lex Luthor, um, and kind of giving an interview with him, kind of be the first to really give Lex Luthor an interview. Um, and then we kind of cut to on the street. On the street, a bus pulls up, and a bunch of people walk out. A young man in a tie and black suit, carrying a suitcase with the initials CK, walks off. And we know this because this is Clark Kent. We know this because his briefcase says CK. And I love the fact he looks around and he sees kind of the city and he's like, I've made it. And he looks around and he kind of says, look, I've made it. And he steps off the bus. And we finally, and as he's getting off the bus, he walks around, and then we see another bus where it's going kind of like in the movie Speed, just going straight down the um, down the hill, and there's like a bunch of people crossing the street. The bus keeps going down the hill, and I think the brakes are cut or brakes are off or something. And then we see, this is a sort of the first moment we see Clark Kent do something heroic where he gets in front of the bus and stops it straight with his hand, and he implants the hand the of the bus, and people are kind of like surprised, but Clark just basically gets up and kind of walks into the shadows, and we see a woman look at him and go, "Who is that man? That man stopped the bus." And she looks around and he's gone. And then meanwhile at the Daily Planet, Lois Lane is typing on the computer. And this is sort of where we get sort of the plot of the episode, when a man is comes into the Daily Planet and says, ask for Lois Lane. And he says, Lois Lane, Lois Lane. And he's in ragged clothes. And he brings Lois Lane a package and kind of warns her about the he warns her about the inevitable danger that's going to be happening at the space station. And he tells her, don't get on the don't you need to be safe, and you need to not get on the bus. You must share and he tells them you must share my story. He says the space plane is doomed, and he leaves a package on Lois's desk. While being carried off by security, Lois is watching and then she looks up and looks at watching the news, and they're talking about the space program and the rocket that's going to be going off. Later that week. Then the TV shifts to Dr. Tanya Baines talking about the failure of the space program and then we see, so they're talking about the space program and how they're about to go off, and she sort of looks at it like there's something going on here. Then we introduced to Cat Grant, who most people probably know her. She's in the comics, and I think she's sort of. I've seen her in a couple episodes of her character in Smallville, but in this version, she works for the Daily Planet, and she's more of the gossip columnist of the planet. So she's been out around town that night doing out of the town, being sort of seeing the nightlight, and she just gets in, and we can see that she's wearing a a kind of a red dress, and she's got makeup on. She's looking at her Palm Pilot. And she ends up asking Lois if she'll still has an active social life. So I'm wondering if throughout the series, she and Kat have kind of a business rivalry going on, but it seems like she's sort of the the socialite columnist of the planet. Meanwhile, Jimmy talks to Lois, who is disputed by Kat. Clark is being, and then we're entered to Perry White's office, where Clark is being interviewed by Perry White, and Perry White he's kind of looking over his resume, Clark's background and reporting, and how Clark was the columnist for the Smallville newspaper. So in this version, he probably did the small town paper before moving to Metropolis and working for the Daily Planet. I know in the Smallville series, we see Clark Kent's journalism in around maybe the pilot and the first 3 episodes of Smallville. And then Perry White kind of talks to Clark and says, this is the Daily Planet. This is the most successful and proper newspaper in the world. It is and how he talks about how grand it is. And I like what happens is that he kind of says how great it is and how sophisticated it is, and then all of a sudden and then Perry gets mad and checks his pulse to see how he's doing, and Clark goes over and says, "Hey, Perry, Mr. White, you seem to have a lot of stress, and you probably need to suggest Pavi leaves to reduce stress." And Perry looks at him and says, "Oh, Clark, you've done some traveling." And Clark says, "This is my first trip to Metropolis." And he says, "I've got some samples if you would like to read them." And of his work, and Perry looks at them over and tells him that, and he kind of does this thing where he kind of tells Clark and looks out into the city and says, "This is the greatest newspaper in the whole world, and the Daily Planet stands for significance." And then he broads it up and says how noble this is, and we do real journalism. And the next thing we hear is Jimmy barges in and says, "Hey, boss, I found some trouble with your horn on the golf cart," and Perry's trying to get Jimmy out, and Lois barges in and tells Perry about a crazy story about an engineer, and Clark starts about the engineer, and Clark starts to perk up, and we kind of can see that these are the stories that Clark is interested in. Perry, and then he says, and then this is where in this version Perry White sort of introduces Clark Kent to Lois Lane, and Lois kind of looks at Clark and says, looks at him kind of as if to say, "Look, I don't have time to, I have no time to, you know, take somebody under my wing." And but Perry tells Clark that he has a lousy resume and doesn't expect to get a job. Clark pleads with Perry that he is a hard worker, but Perry has nothing for him to do. Clark thanks Perry for seeing him and gives Perry a firm handshake. I like how he gives him a firm handshake, and we kind of see that's his first time of showing his Superman strength, if you will. And seeing him and gives Perry a firm handshake. In his hand, Clark goes to, and then we see Clark going to his hotel room, or I guess his apartment building, in Claw's Ma and Pa Kent. And there's this kind of moment where we kind of get, Pa Ma Kent in this version, they're, kind of an elderly couple, but you could probably assume that they're probably in their 50s or 60s. And and I like how she's on Ma Kent is on the phone going like, so tell me, how's everything going in Metropolis? And Paul Kent is, or Jonathan Kent is like, hope you're keeping safe, and you're keeping safe and making not getting into any trouble. And Jonathan offers to wire some cash to Clark in Metropolis, and so the interview, and he also tells Clark Clark tells Pa Kent that the interview went bad. Jonathan offers to wire him some cash, and Martha's making sure that he's doing well and being careful. And this is sort of this I think scene really makes, we kind of see how Ma and Pa Kent relationships, or how they are parents. And I think in this version, because I think in a lot of the other Superman stories, Pa Kent ends up dying. In Superman the movie, he ends up getting a heart attack. In Man of Steel, he ends up getting sucked in by a tornado. And in this one, he is I think he and Martha are still there, and are still there, and I think that, and I think I've only seen the pilot episode, but they seem to be sort of a secondary character for Clark Kent. And then I also kind of like that both Martha and Pa Kent are afraid that he is going to be discovered as a superhuman being, that they're scared that he's going to be, that Clark will be put into a laboratory and being experimented on or even dissected on. And he tells Clark that he needs to be careful. And I kind of like in this version. Well, I mean, he's using a payphone because I guess this was '93. Cell phones still around, weren't around as much, and he's lying on bed, I like the fact he's lying in the bed, and he's in a dingy apartment, and the apartment reminded me so much of Peter Parker's apartment in Spider-Man 2. Um, and we kind of know that because the um, the light bulb keeps flickering, and this gives Clark. So Clark looks up and kind of gets annoyed that the light keeps flickering. So he walks up the wall and turns the light bulb in to change it, and then floats back down. And he feels like I like the fact that he shows that he's done something successful. And I like how he just falls into bed after he just walks off the wall, walks down the wall, and falls into bed. And then we see Lois Lane's coming in from the grocery store to her place. So we kind of see how Lois Lane lives. And in her place, she calls out for her sister, Lucy Lane. And Lucy Lane, I could see that Lois Lane in this version probably would be in her 30s. And I can say Lucy Lane is a little bit younger because she's younger in the comics and in a lot of other renditions. And she asks, and she's kind of come in from, I think, taking a shower, and Lucy asks Lois if Lois has found a date for Lex Luthor's ball tonight. And she offers if Mitchell, who we don't see, would be a good date. And Lois and Lucy, they kind of I kind of can see how both Terry Hatcher and the actress that plays Lucy really work like sisters. Because Lucy says, you're going to scare men away. Lucy would just hate for her to sit at home. And Lois kind of takes takes it and says, I have dates. And Lucy's like, you don't have dates, you have interviews. They're not the same thing. And Lucy, and she's kind of like, you don't really meet guys, you just kind of, interview them in a way. And it's sort of, Lucy wants him to meet like a quota. And then you need to meet, and I like the fact that she says you need to meet like a super guy, and I think that's I think Lois is at this point is looking for her Superman to rescue her from her dating life. And we kind of get to see Lois, and I like how Lois she's in bed and she's eating popcorn and she's watching a soap opera called The Ivory Tower, which I guess is a Metropolis show. And she sees the actors on the TV screen kiss, and Lois sobs because I think Lois really wants something like that. And then we see kind of the next day, this is the we're getting into. There's the B plot where uh, we see a group of picketers are wanting the theater to stay open. They're like, we won't let the theater close. Go away, go. And there's picket signs, and Clark is there, and he's kind of watching it. They've got a wrecking ball about to hit the theater, and Clark uses his X-ray vision. Um, X-ray vision to see inside the theater, and he sees a elderly actress doing a monologue. So Clark uses the X-ray, his heat vision, to stop the wrecking ball, and then wrecking ball. So then Clark goes into the theater and he kind of listens to this actress doing a monologue of the cherry orchard, and cherry orchard that she does, and she says, and Clark ends up clapping and says he's a fan, and the old woman says, "Look, I'm not leaving this establishment." And she talks about how, back in the day, people came from miles to see these plays, and this theater was full of people that were fans of the dramatic arts. And there's this kind of great moment where they can Clark kind of has a moment with this elderly lady. And this gives Clark to write more of a, kind of inspires him to write the think piece for Perry about this woman's sort of career and how she started on Broadway and became a star. And I really like to, and he's typing it up and saying, and it's a nice moment, or it's an interesting kind of B plot. And this pretty much he gives it to Perry White, and Perry reads it and loves it and hires Kent on the spot to be the next member of the Daily Planet. Member of the Daily Planet. Then on the news, we get into kind of part two, or the A plot of the story, or the B plot, where we see there's a story about a fire and how a spacecraft might blow up, and they're going to cover the story, which is interesting that the pilot episode deals with a spacecraft, because both Superman Returns dealt with a space, or a plane that was about to fall into space. And this one deals with the spacecraft. And what I like about it is so Perry says to Lois to take Clark with her to kind of cover the story. And Clark says, and Lois is like, "Look, Clark, look, Chief, I can do it myself." And Perry says, "No, you need to take Clark with you." And she reluctantly says, "Okay, come on, Smallville, let's get this over with." And she reluctantly takes him. So this is when Clark and Lois are on their first story. And Lois ends up going to Dr. Platt's apartment, where or apartment or office, and Dr. Platt is looking at a microscope. And Lois asks, how can it bypass security if it came from orders higher up? Dr. Platt says, it's all in his report that he gave to Dr. Baines. Dr. Platt is getting a bunch of pieces of paper of notes for his report. And Lois looks at the portrait of Dr. Platt's family. And where is his wife and daughter? Or let's say, okay, so he's looking at the report, and we notice that Dr. Platt, I think he's widowed. He's widowed, and he wants to know about where his or Lois wants to know where's his wife, and Dr. Platt says so Lois asks where Dr. Platt's family is, and Dr. Platt says they left him. Lois asks Dr. Platt who would want to sabotage, and she's kind of curious about who would want to sabotage the space station Prometheus. And Dr. Platt talks about using a microgravity laboratory to use science, and he's like, we're going to use a microgravity laboratory to use science to cure millions of diseases here on Earth, and a zero gravity environment, and how he talks about how its face they can separate the protons that form viruses. And Dr. Platt says we could cure so many children with crippling diseases. And he is also looking for a cure. He's also looking for a cure for his daughter. And he comes off a little bit like a mad scientist. This sort of scares Lois a little bit. We also find out that Lois discovers that through her investigation that Dr. Samuel Platt dismissal from the space facility and the explosive shuttle. Let's see. And then Lois kind of gets, after she interviews Dr. Platt, Lois goes and talks to Dr. Baines about Samuel Platt. And Dr. Baines hands Dr. Baines looks over Samuel Platt's files, and she goes over that he's been drinking and was let go. Lois asks about collective devices, and Lois gives her card to Dr. Baines. And then Lois and Clark are leaving the space facility, and Clark talks about how cooperative Dr. Baines was. And Clark also mentions to Lois that Dr. Baines was very attractive, and this sets off Lois. Goes off and talks about that's typical male to assume she's telling the truth because she's attractive. Back at the Daily Planet, Jimmy is giving Clark a tour, and I like the fact that Jimmy's the one giving the tour, where he's kind of showing him where everything is. And he's saying, this is this office, this is the office, this is the bullpen where we do all the discussions, and kind of the sections of each where the paper is. Like this, there's the sports section team over here. There's the business team over here. There's and and so he's getting a tour by Jimmy, and um, Lois is getting a cup of coffee, and Cat Grant starts to notice Clark, and Cat's got sort of this really kind of red dress on, and she's kind of playing with her hair, and 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 she introduces herself to Clark Kent. She says she writes for a column called Cat's Corner, and she says she's offering to show Clark around the town, and Cat says, "I'll show you around town just because you're new here." And he says that would be great. And she says, "Well then, that makes it a date." Back at Clark and Lois's desk, Lois is getting on the phone with her boyfriend, who we do not see in the episode, and Lois kind of begrudgingly asks Clark to Lex's ball, but Clark is like he's not into social stuff. He would rather just go home and go to his apartment and go to bed. But Lois tries to suggest it to Clark and calls it the biggest social event of the season in Metropolis. Clark kind of goes and says, "Well, if this is a biggest season, do you mean this is going to be a date?" But Lois kind of shuts that down and saying it's business. And Lois is determined to find the first one-on-one interview with Lex Luthor, and says to her, "You're going to be there at 9." And then that night, we kind of see Clark first time going up, and away because he walks through the alleyway, and he starts to kind of put his hand up and go up, and away, and he hovers just a little bit off the ground, and a bum shows up and says, "Hey buddy, can you spare $1?" And Clark kind of looks at him and reluctantly gives him $1. The bum calls him an angel, and we get to see him fly through the city. And what's kind of cool is the way we see him fly through the city. He's still in his suit, and he's got his hands out, and he's flying around, and we see all of Metropolis. Um, Metropolis, and as he's flying through Metropolis, he ends up landing back at the farm in Smallville, and he ends up having dinner with his parents. And at dinner with his parents, um, Martha asks Clark about who's this Lois Lane you're working with, and Clark calls her complicated, pig-headed, and I like how he says it. He's like, she's complicated, pig-headed, and brilliant. And Clark Clark ends up hugging his mom and thanks her for sewing his jacket. And Martha suggests to Clark should take another route. And I liked how, like in a lot of the other Superman series, especially Smallville, which I've watched. Smallville, I think Clark or Jonathan and Martha are more of like still afraid that you're gonna find out. But this version of Clark and Martha, or Pa and Ma Kent, Jonathan and Martha Kent, they are kind of like, how long did it take? They're pretty cool. Like he's been doing this for a while, probably since college. Clark's uh, then Clark and Jonathan have kind of a moment to look at in the stars and kind of have a father-son moment. Talk about the stars and how the city is like a busy metropolis and how you can't see stars like these in this city. And we kind of get the fact that Clark is pretty happy with working in the metropolis and especially working for the planet because for him it's a dream come true. Um, but Jonathan can tell that Clark just can't. And I like how this one, Clark can't fit in because he's kind of angry about that. So he super kicks a rock and he super kicks a rock and it flies over like the hill and um, it talks about how he's kind of tired. I love the fact that Clark is still tired about guard, guarding his powers and sacrificing living just a normal life and being human and having a family. But Jonathan says, "We need to protect you and make sure no one knows he comes from Krypton." And this episode, Clark still hasn't found his Superman origin. We're still trying to find his Superman origin. That night at the party, Clark and Jimmy, or Clark's with Jimmy, and Clark asks Jimmy if he's ever met this Lex Luthor, and Jimmy says Jimmy says no, but Jimmy starts going over his sort of how we can tell that Jimmy in this version is a fan um, of Lex Luthor because Jimmy says no, but he starts to spew that Jimmy has read all of Lex Luthor's autobiographies, that he's a self-made man, employs thousands of employees, man of the year every year, is a Renaissance man, but rarely appears in public. He won't give personal interviews, and Lex Luthor starts walking the um, down the stairs, and we finally see this Lex Luthor. And what's interesting about this Lex Luthor is he has hair. He walks down the stairs, shaking hands with people and reporters and generals and big name people. And Lois is staring down Lex and calls him out and asks Lex why he's not returned her calls. And Lex and Lois Lane are properly introduced. Jimmy and Clark look onward at Lois while she is talking to Lex. And Jimmy comments on Lois's tenacity to talk to Lex. And as she's talking to Lex, Clark kind of floats up just to see above the a couple inches from the ground, just to see what's going on. Over on the dance floor, we see Lex and Lois dancing, and Lois apologizes to Lex about being bold and upfront, but Lex is saying being bold is very attractive. And Lois asks Lex if he's willing to give. And they're dancing, and we can see that Lex is sort of flirting with Lois and say being, and he finds her boldness very attractive. And she asks Lex if he's willing to give an interview, even though he might be hesitant to do so. He would not want to be misinterpreted. And he sort of tells her that look, I've been having trouble with the media, and Lois says, "Not with me," and Lex suggests they make. When Lex, while he's flirting with her, says, "Let's make it a dinner date." Clark comes, and Clark kind of sees that, and he starts cutting in. And I kind of like this is where Lex, this version of Lex and Clark Kent meet and it reminds me very much of how Batman and Superman met in the at the party um, at the party when Lex introduces them in Batman v Superman. Lex sort of sees, once Clark, it kind of breaks up the interview for Lois, and Lois is pissed to the fact that um, Clark ruined her chance to interview Lex Luthor, and she tells Clark that it took me like 6 months to get, um, 6 months to get, took her a year to get him to do this interview, and Clark and Lois bicker about bicker about dancing, and Lois ends up walking away from Clark into Luthor's study. So she starts to snoop around, um, and Clark ends up follows her in, and they kind of snoops, and Lois is snooping around and around Lex's office, and as he walks around, a sword comes up to Clark's throat. The shiny, sword's hand is none other than Lex Luthor with the knife, and he starts talking about how the knife belonged to Alexander the Great and how he became king of Asia with this sword. And going back to Smallville, what I kind of liked about that is there was a lot more. Because in Smallville, I noticed that that Lex Luthor asks sort of questions of, says this was a something from a tribe or something from history, and I think I've noticed that's one thing that Lex has that he really sort of likes or admires history, and which I've noticed is a lot of really big in, like, how Lionel Luthor in Smallville talks about history. And I think Lex as a character in the comic books is very big into is probably a history buff. Lois comes in and Lex shows them kind of the balcony and how Lex's building is the tallest building in Metropolis. He says people have to look up to see so they can see him. So, well, I think Lex Luthor in a lot of the comics has a big ego, and I like how Lex in this comic or this version, we really get to see his big ego, and um, and then he kind of says to Lois and Clark, "Why don't you meet me downstairs? I have a big announcement. I have an announcement to make for the party that might interest them." So we see people dancing and having a good time, and Lex kind of clings his drink and makes an announcement that the Luthor House for homeless children will be a reality. Lex tells the crowd about how the space station Prometheus was canceled, and he talks about and he ends up going and he talks about how he's going to start this orphanage. So Lex starts making the announcement that he is going to be about how he's going to start um, a group home or orphanage called the Luther House for the Homeless Children will be a reality, and people clapped, and uh, then Lex tells the crowd about how the space station Prometheus was canceled, and he talks about the benefits that the pharmaceuticals that could cure diseases that may not be lost as the citizens of this planet. And Luther kind of decides that even though we've lost Prometheus, I've decided that I propose my own space station called Space Station Luther. The we see a '90s hologram of the station, kind of on the screen, and which is interesting because I think in Man of Steel you see a Luther. Maybe it was a Wayne. Never mind. I think it was a Wayne satellite. And he talks about the station. Later that night, we see Lex is laying down, watching the fire burn. And this was a weird scene because he's watching the fire burn, and then a cobra slithers up to him, and they have the stare down. And as the snake slithers off the doorway, a man in a turban looks stunned that the snake didn't scare him. Asiv is the man in the turban, and he asks Lex if that will be all for the evening, and Lex says that would be all. And then we see Lex end up smoking a cigar. So I don't know. That scene kind of came out of nowhere, and it kind of reminded me of, I mean, him being by the fire, and I don't know. Maybe it was him to sort of uh, face his fears of snakes. I don't know if Lex Luthor has a fear of snakes in the comics. Um, so Lex Luthor's smoking his cigar, and the next morning, Clark and Lois are walking to the planet. Lois says she's been up for hours, and Lois went went back to F lab, but Dr. Baines ended up throwing her out. Then near a manhole cover, a small explosion happens, and one of the workers says, "There's a man down there." So this is sort of Clark's, I guess, second time to show that he's a hero. Um, Clark goes down the sewer like a Ninja Turtle, which is kind of cool because he ends up pulling the manhole cover off and then just going down the sewer. Um, and Clark rescues the man from the manhole. He coughs and points out to Clark that Clark saved him, and Clark's like, "Wait a minute, that's not me." And Clark into Cat Grant, and Cat Grant starts to um, Cat Grant tries to ask him out dinner for a dinner date, and she's kind of taken aback that Clark has denied her 2 times, and she says that asking out men for dinner twice is something I rarely do. And most men would say yes the first time. And then Lois ends up coming out of the elevator and she scoffs at Clark and Kat. And Clark says, to Kat that let's have a rain check on that dinner. And he ends up running off. So Clark walks back to the office to see Lois going over her notes. And Lois says, says, catnapping in reference to Kat talking to Clark. Clark is like, wait a minute, and he ends up firmly changing the subject about the spacecraft mission. And he says, let's not talk about this. Let's talk about the spacecraft mission. And Lois is like, okay, here's the stuff that I found out about what went on in Planet's report, and that the rocket about the rockets, and if Bane got a copy of it. Lois tells Clark, I hope he didn't. He did Clark that I hope you didn't make dinner plans because it's gonna be a long night. And then and then at Luther's house, Luther is talking to Dr. Annette Baines about how Lois needs to be silent. So we know that Lex is sort of kind of the mastermind behind the space program stuff, and he tells her to be silent, and Baines can to be and Baines can worry about Platt, but Lex Luthor really wants the reporter to himself. And then Annette asks Lex if he has any feelings for Clark Kent or Lois Lane. And Annette tells Lex to stay away from Lois. May not be easy. Stay away from Lois. It may not be easy for him. Uh, she tries to seduce Lex and starts kissing Annette. Annette, how he adores, not like he kisses her and he says, I adore you, and not like threatens, and that won't let Lois interfere. Meanwhile, back at the Daily Planet, Lois and Clark are diligently writing and researching about the space shuttle story. Lois is starving and suggests Chinese food. Clark says he knows a place and either flies or runs real fast to Shanghai, China from Metropolis, which is in New York according to the map. And he brings back steamed dumplings after they eat the meal. And after they open their fortune cookies that are in Chinese, Lois calls him. She looks at them, and they open the fortune cookies, and she looks at them as these are written in Chinese, and Clark can kind of read Chinese, and um, and Lois kind of calls him strange and not to fall for her. She has no time for this. So we can tell that Lois is pretty much like she has a thing for Clark, but kind of is still trying to be more reserved. So and then Clark, um, um, for that, then they take a cab to for she has no time for that. Then I like the next scene. They take a cab to an abandoned building in the in and they walk into the condemned building. A light is fusing, and Lois goes into the back door, and Clark suggests he go in first, but Lois lets him know she's been through it. They walk up to an armchair, and they go through the door and they walk up into this kind of abandoned room, and they see a armchair. A man is sitting there where there is electricity going through. It's Dr. Pratt's body as he is sitting there dead. And then the police come in with a detective looking over the crime scene, and the police officers talk um, scene, the police officer to the crime scenes, and Clark takes you know, and the police officer are looking at the crime scene, and they make a joke, and Clark takes offense to it, and Clark's apartment, he's talking to his parents over the phone. Both mom and pa can are talking to him on like two phones at the same time. This was the 90s. Can I say, Clark is distressed with Dr. Pratt's death, but also Jonathan Kent. And Jonathan Kent concerned with um, is more concerned that someone will recognize Clark during might have recognized Clark during the manhole incident. Jonathan mentions that one day you will save someone and they'll record it, and Clark will be exposed. And Martha asks Clark if he needs any fresh cloths. Clark asks his mother if she can make him an outfit. And and a disguise, if you will. Just then, a knock on the door, and Clark says it's Lois again. He hangs up and opens the door, and who is it? None other than Lois Lane. And she looks at him like, cause he just got out of the shower, and he's soaking wet, and he's got a towel on. He opens the door, and she looks at him up from toe to from head to toe, and says, "What is this hunk doing?" Or she's thinking to herself, "What is this hunk doing here?" And she mixes her words and says, "I thought you'd be naked." And then she kind of corrects herself and says, "I mean, ready." And Clark says he was on the phone. He'd be ready in a jiff. As Clark gets dressed, Lois takes a tour of Clark's place and looks around his kitchen and is wowed by his place. And I think she thinks lives like a slob. And then Clark comes out of his room, and Lois is shocked that he lives like an 8-year-old and dresses like a model. She scoffs and leaves the apartment. Back at the Daily Planet, Lois is on the phone about Dr. Henderson's death. Lois still thinks the death was a murder, but the coroner is calling it a suicide. Clark mentions to Lois that Miss Pratt and her daughter Amy are at the Planet. Amy is in a wheelchair. Mrs. Pratt talks to Lois how how Mrs. Pratt hasn't told Amy about her father's death, that that she thought that Lois thought that Mrs. Pratt divorced her, left her husband, but the reason why they left was they were afraid that someone was going to follow them and take Amy away. And she tells Miss Pratt tells Lois that Prometheus was being sabotaged, and that's what got him killed. And she says to him that I don't want this to be what causes suicide. Then we get on to the television show called Lextel Communications with a special report. and they're at like a United Nations press conference where I guess it's called the Congress of Nations, and they have unlimited that they've canceled the space program. They didn't really bow to Lex Luthor's terms. So the United Nations have decided not to go with Lex Luthor's plan. They've canceled the launch for next week. The rockets will also carry an exfiltration method. Should any serious problems arise, we shall be forced to cancel the mission. And they anticipate success. So then Jimmy comes back, comes and he was talking about how he just got back from Star Labs. Now, Star Labs, if you've seen The Flash, you know that that's where Barry Allen works, is Star Labs. And so that's kind of a nice Easter egg. And then then Jimmy talks about how Star Labs recreated the launch in the hologram. And they conclude that the theory was right all along. The transport explosion worked, and so Lois congratulates him. And then Lois tells Clark that they can finally write the story. And then I like the fact that Lois and Clark bicker about how they can write the story with her help, with his help, and that they can get and they can convince people that they sabotage was behind it. They end up hugging, and they have a moment, and then he asks her if to dinner to celebrate, and she says no. She says yes. She says yes, but then she cancels it and says she has plans for tonight. And let Clark kind of ask her if it was Luthor, and this gets Clark jealous in a way. And Clark asks Lois, how far is he gonna go to, for her to find the truth? This is when they start to bicker like a married couple where Clark starts to tell Lois that you've she says she has plans tonight with Lex Luthor, and Clark takes that to heat and says, how far are you gonna go to get this interview? And she's like, says it's not in your concern. And they start to fight, and he says, you've had how he blames her that she's had a chip on her shoulder since the day that since the day they met each other, and you resemble the fact that you and he basically calls Lois Lane a snob, and she says I live by and that angers her, and she says I live by three rules. I never and she does three things. She never does three things. She never sleeps with anyone she works with. She never she never lets anyone get there first, and she never gets involved with anyone during her stories. And she says, I don't get anyone I work with. And this pisses off Clark. Meanwhile, later that night at Lex's mansion. Lex and Lois are having a date, and Lois asks Lex that she wants to know the real Lex Luthor. What's your kicks? What makes you who you are, kind of thing. And she says, "Does that?" He asks her, "Does that surprise her?" And then she goes through um, kind of his biography that he took over his first company when he was like 21. And in this version, Lex's parents both died when he was 14, and how he took over the company when he was 21, and how Lois wants to know the real Lex and what he strives for. What does he want? And he says the pleasure in the pursuit of pleasure. I guess you'd have to say power, and he says the power would be a means to no end. And then we get into the backstory of how he took over the company when he was 21. And he changes the subject about how the food is and how the uh, food is and how her wine tastes. And then he starts to kind of flirt with Lois a little bit about how she's so tense and how she should let her defense down. And she kind of takes it as like, I really wanted this to be an interview and not just a dinner date. Lex pretty much tells Lois to kind of lay down your hair and relax, but you're so tense. She tells him, he tells her that she's so tense. Let your defenses down. I think you got the wrong. And Lois is a little bit like, well, I think you got the wrong idea for the date. And he starts to kind of seduce her and say, "You're really a beautiful young woman. You look at the things and want to scoop a quick pro quo. The talent is not to make money. It's not juggling companies. It's character assessment. And I sense things about you." Like he kind of goes in from going to being really sort of polite, and he tells her that she is beautiful, and this turns off Lois a little bit. She says, "Look, I need to probably get going. I have a story to write." And he offers for dessert, and she says, "I never have dessert." And she says, "You don't know what you're missing." So then Lois is driven by Lex to her apartment. And I like that her apartment looks like a pretty decent place. I mean, and so as she's getting out of the car to get to her room or into her apartment building, Lex basically plays it like a gentleman and walks her to her door. Little do they know that Clark walks over. Clark is in the neighborhood, and he kind of goes into the alleyway and kind of just sort of looks at and see why, and he's kind of pondering, why is Lex Luthor running to um, Lex Luthor is why is Lois Lane dating Lex Luthor? And then there's something that I've never seen in a version of Superman
in any Superman, Lois and Lex Luthor. Well, I've never seen them actually go on a date in any other version, but Lois and Lex Luthor kiss goodnight, and they have a kind of decently passionate lip to lip kiss. And he says goodnight, and she goes back to her apartment, and she's completely pissed because she kind of screwed up her interview and how she blew it. And Lucy Lane comes up to her and says, what if do you think Lex will ask her out again? And she says, I don't know. And Lucy says, what do you think? He says that Lex Luthor is the world's most eligible bachelor. And then Lucy kind of assures Lois by saying, what do you think? Mr. Right could even be right out there in that big city. Little did they know that Superman or Clark Kent is that little do they know that Clark Kent is basically spying on Lois Lane outside her door, and Lois is a little bit complex, complex because she's like, this is reality we're talking about. And she goes to the window and looks out to see maybe her man in flying armor or shining armor would be out there. And Clark looks looks up and flies up and away. The next the next morning, at the planet, Lois and Clark are giving a giving the story to Perry about the Prometheus spaceship got sabotaged. That the space transport method carrying a habitation module to space station Prometheus in less than 3 days is probably also going to blow up. So he kind of doesn't believe that Lois and Clark and Jimmy are actually telling the truth, and he talks about the about Platt and how Platt, did went undergo psychiatric treatment and also committed suicide and also abandoned his family. But he said he was probably murdered, and he says that's about sums it up. So after being chewed out by Perry White, Lois, Clark, and Jimmy walk out of the office, and Lois tells Clark that they're going to need some hard evidence. And Lois tells Clark that Plant is involved. And she also tells Clark that the spaceship is going to go up in 2 days. And he says, I'm making a call. And then uh, Clark Clark is making a call to F F to Airpred, and he goes and Lois ends up going with Jimmy the out to investigate more. Meanwhile, Perry White is uh, taking Clark's advice and using pave leaves. He starts smelling them and eating them, and she chews on one of them. Meanwhile, or back at Pratt's at the loading dock of the space station where they're making the spaceships or spacecrafts, Lois and Jimmy are kind of snooping around, and and they're watching how they're working on the demolished uh, spacecraft. And Lois says, "I watched them load the messenger wreckage." And how the whole left side of the spacecraft is bashed in, but the one that they're working on is not. So then Jimmy and Lois go and do some snooping, which is something that we see a lot in a lot of Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen. And when Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen are in a Superman show, they do a lot of snooping. I saw that a lot in the animated show and, of course, the '60s show. So they walk down in the storage room and look around. There's a door to the office building, and Jimmy picks the lock, and Lois calls him amazing, and she asks him where did he learn how to do that. He says it was reform school. So they end up opening the door, and unfortunately for Lois and Jimmy, uh, Miss Pratt, Dr. Baines looks on and calls Lex and says the reporter and Jimmy Olsen are snooping around. And Lex tells her to kill off the Daily Planet star. And how she suggests it's him. And Annette says, I'll take care of that. And Lex uh, tells her that Lois Lane and that Lois Lane or that Lex is gonna take care of Lois Lane for Annette. And Annette's like, I did this for you, Lex. So Annette goes and pulls out of the drawer a gun and goes to look for Lex or goes to look for Jimmy and Lois. Jimmy and Lois are snooping around and trying to um, find evidence. They look and they find the capsule from the spacecraft that blew up. They go look around and take some photos of um, the spacecraft when all of a sudden the henchman from Annette's henchman or Lex Luthor's henchman knocks out Jimmy and ends up knocking out Lois. But Lois, because I think in the comics, Lois is father is the general. She kind of has a couple moves to sort of defend herself. So she slaps him with her purse and kicks him and hits him with the purse again. But then, of course, she knocks out the man and then goes to check to see Jimmy while the man that she knocked out tries to get up. And we see kind of how she does a lot of she kind of can do some self-defense stuff because the man that attacked her has a knife and she kind of kicks him and he falls down and then all of a sudden we hear a click of a gun, and it's Annette saying, "Good job, Lois." And it's kind of nice, I guess, if you think about it in this time frame of the '90s. It's having a female villain is a really interesting something that at the time, I think now it's pretty common, but probably at the time it was like a great sort of twist of this episode is the twist of this episode is her as this that she is the villainess if you think about it, and she does say something like, "These days a woman has to know self-defense." And then the man that she beat up gets up and puts the gun to her back and carries her and forces her back into the space station. So then we're back at the Daily Planet, and Perry White's gathered everybody up to do kind of a late night reporting, and they go through, and there's a joke about the um, this this joke about the piece on the sex change of the royal family. Um, and they kind of, and I like the fact that Perry's like, well, I don't really think we should kind of get into that. Um, and so that's kind of a nice, funny joke. And then Perry asks where Jimmy and Lois are. And um, And Clark is like, I think they're supposed to be somewhere, and he doesn't really. He thinks that something's not right for Jimmy and Lois to miss a and staff meeting. So Clark gets up and wants to go look for them, and as he gets up, Perry White sees him and says, "Can't you know the meeting's not over?" And Clark kind of says, it's not like Lois and Jimmy to miss a staff meeting. I'll go. Basically, he tells Clark that I'm gonna go check on him. So then Clark kind of does sort of a superhero, sort of a superhero thing where he goes and walks into a storage closet, and we think as the audience that he is going to, this is the first time he's going to don the suit of Superman and change clothes and then come out with his Superman suit. And so as he opens the door, he goes straight to the window and the window doesn't budge, and right before he gets out of the wind tries to get out of the window, Kent or not Kent Perry White finds him in the storage closet and says, "What are you doing? We've got a staff meeting." And Clark tries to play it cool, and Perry White asks Clark if he finished making his phone call, and Clark said, "I did." And or I was just about to, sir. And Clark or Perry White says, "Did you make your phone call?" And he says, "Yes, sir." And then he asks him when he's coming back. And there's this sort of pun joke where he says, "When have you decided to be coming out of the closet?" And he says, "Very soon." So Clark ends up headed over to the docks or the spacecraft office where Lois is being held, and he hears Lois's voice saying, "What do you want to do with me?" And you'll never get away with this, that kind of stuff. And he goes over to he hears them, and uses his X-ray. Then uses his X-ray vision, and he sees Lois uh, being a hostage, and she he looks over and breaks open the door and says, "Let her go," and then uh, let her go, and then and they're like going, "Or what?" And we realize that uh, Lois Lane, or we see that Clark Kent isn't Superman yet. He's still Clark Kent, and he's still in his glasses and um, suit and tie, and they realize, and as we see it's kind of interesting because it's the first time we see him with break the door open and do something, and he's kind of his first heroic move. But I like the fact that even though it's his first heroic move, he's not in a suit and he doesn't have a secret identity. That he sort of ends up becoming a hostage himself, and I like how he says it because he says, "Put down these guns, or all," and then kind of realizes that he's in a sticky situation. And Lois looks at him like, "Oh God, my rescuer is this guy, Clark Kent." And I kind of like that it's not like, um, oh, he dons the suit right then and there. I like how he's still mild mannered Clark Kent when he rescues Lois for the first time. And then, so Lois and Clark are handcuffed to the um, pole, and Lois just starts bickering that she can't believe you came barreling in here. She can't believe you came barreling in here, Clark. That I told Perry that I need a task force, not some amateur. And she's like, I really thought. And she gets all hysterical and talks to him about the fact that he's got testosterone and that he is some Boy Scout, and they start bickering. And I like the fact that Clark just basically uh, takes the lock off the chains and frees himself at just normal. And I like how he does it while she is still bickering, and she says something like, "At least I have the guts to go and find the story, Clark." And I like how she kind of realizes that that it's her fault, and she goes from sort of hysterical to someone who just needs a hero. And I think that's what makes her character interesting, or Lois Lane as the character itself, is that she is strong and hardworking and hard nosed and can handle herself. And she kind of talks about how she wants to get the respect she she wants, and she starts to talk about how, oh, I'm hardworking, and I'm and I'm hardworking, and if you wanted to get out of this, we would have done it already. And then she ends up sort of realizing that she is a little vulnerable. um she is vulnerable, that she kind of realizes that, you know, she's not as tough as she thinks she is. And she starts crying, and I sometimes do. She says she sometimes do things, like jump into the pool without checking the water level first. But Clark, it's the only way I know how to do it, how to get the job done. So she kind of says things that she says it how she wants to get. She then mentions that she talks to him about her three rules, and she tells Clark that, I've broken every one of those rules before. And then we hear that how Lois kind of made a mistake by sleeping with somebody at work, and it was this French guy named Claude, and how she was in love with him, or thought she was. And she actually told him that she was writing a story, and we find out that Claude stole her story, and she didn't thank him, or he didn't thank her for her input. So Clark consults Lois by saying, it doesn't matter how smart you are, or how, intrigued you are, you're only human. We're only human, and we're going to be making mistakes. And then Lois, who is, so positive, says, what difference does it make anyway? We're still gonna die. And he starts looking at his chain, or Clark starts looking at his handcuffs that he's got on, and starts talking to Lois about what she said about respect, and how everybody at the planet respects Lois, uh, and everyone thinks that she's the best reporter they ever met. Perry told me that at the interview, and Lois starts sobbing and says, "He did." But and then Clark pretty much tells Lois that he thinks he's pretty swell too, and just to make her feel a little bit better. And they're having this sort of moment where they're really getting to kind of know each other, and she's all hysterical and saying, "Oh, we're about to die, but I'm glad you're here with me." And then Dr. Baines shows up and sort of stops the whole them, talking. And she starts kind of doing the whole villainess thing. She asked, or Lois asked Dr. Baines, why are you doing this? And she said, of course, it's for profit. It'll belong to those who get there first. Kind of how the space travel is kind of the next big, great frontier. And Dr. Baines is going to start a accident, if you will, by making the monothylase dryzine leak and start an explosion. And the explosion is supposedly going to engulf the hangar where the space station is, and it's supposed to be killing um, uh, it's supposed to kill Clark and Lois because they're still in the building. And then she says, fortunately, you guys will have to, be like Napoleon blown apart kind of thing. And then she goes over and, talks to them. And we then see the chemicals combine and pour themselves down the drain. Clark gets breaks out of these chains and frees Lois, and they make a to run for it after grabbing Jimmy. There's a big explosion in the warehouse, but they make it out alive. And Lois and Clark grabs Lois, and they fly just a little bit above into a puddle of mud, while while the warehouse explodes. They look around and they see a helicopter flying in the air with a net in it. And as the helicopter flies off, the helicopter itself goes boom and explodes. And we see then it uh, goes straight to a screen where Lex Luthor, who planted a bomb on Annette's plane, he's watching from his lecture hall, saying good night, Annette. Back at the Daily Planet, we're at a celebration party for the front page that Lois and Clark and Jimmy have written. And I like how it's the way it is they're in like birthday hats, and it looks almost like a um, New Year's Eve party, and they're celebrating. Clark looks pretty smug in his suits, um, and Lois asked Jimmy if he was scared, and Jimmy said, "Scared? No, no, ladies, not at all," because he's talking to a gaggle of girls who we can kind of see that he's probably using this to kind of bend his game a little bit. So Jimmy's kind of talking some game about kind of being in that situation with the all these girls. Then Perry shows up and tells everybody that the space program is back on, and then goes straight to Lois and tells Lois no can do. There's no news reporters allowed on this space station. And Lois says, imagine having Daily Planet doing the first ever interview on the first space station, and Perry White says he still can't can't do it. Then Perry tells Clark about Mrs. Pratt and her daughter, and how they're in his office waiting for him. And but then we have a moment where Clark Lois tells Clark that if you ever breathe a word of what happened at the warehouse, I will personally tell you that I will personally let everybody else know. So then we're at the space station, kind of in space control station, and it's about to be launched, and they're doing they're just testing, just to see if everything is ready to go. And then Clark is back home at the farm, and they're discussing about Clark's disguise to be Superman. And so they kind of start to do this is a kind of nice cool scene where they're doing a montage of costumes to kind of this is how Clark kind of gets his superhero suit in this Superman suit in this one. So he starts off by wearing a kind of a jungle looking suit where he's wearing kind of green spandex and uh, orange, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Aquaman meets Tarzan a little bit. And he says, it's not worked for him.
The next one looks a little bit more like between Green Lantern and the Flash. That doesn't work out. That doesn't work. And then his mom starts doing, making the suit for him. One of them looks like the Phantom in a way. And I kind of like how this montage we get to see kind of the suits, how they all work, and then we finally see him in a blue suit, getting closer and closer to looking like Superman. Blue and red kind of cape the Superman outfit, and they kind of agree on that. And she says, "No one's going to be looking at your face." And Ma Kent says, "No one's going to be looking at your face." And she says that, but there is something missing. She goes under the bed to find the baby blanket they found him in from a long time ago, and this is where she. So this is where they found the S for Superman that was with the baby blanket, and then in his red boots, blue cape, or red cape, he is officially has the Superman emblem on. And it's kind of I like how in this version his mom is the one that makes him the suit, as opposed to it coming from Crypt, the Fortress of Solitude, like in Smallville, or in the Fortress of Solitude, like in Superman. But I like the fact that and he takes off his glasses, and he starts. They end up watching um, the space program or the space station go up in T minus four. Clark or Pa Kent makes a comment about the fact that how this is such a historic occasion, and how when Clark was a kid they ended up watching the moon landing, and how significant that was. And I like how we kind of see that this Clark is sort of this Clark is in the 90s. Martha is worried that what if somebody recognizes Clark as Superman, and Clark's like, I don't think they will, Mom, because it won't be me. Because he has his glasses on, he takes out his off his glasses, and I like how this sort of shows how Superman works, where people can tell that he's not Superman by the glasses thing. It makes kind of decent sense. Meanwhile, at the space station, Lois is about to board the space station, and she ends up walk as they're all walking in. She turns as then they go straight to the right. She turns to the left, and she hides away in one part of the space station as they've got T minus 1 second, T minus 1 minute to go. Lois straps herself into the uh, rocket. As she straps herself in, she notices a beeping sound. Beep, beep, beep. And it's a bomb on the space station. And this is sort of super. And I like how this is basically where this is Superman's first time as a super, kind of doing something heroic as Superman, where the bomb is sort of the MacGuffin for him to, spring into action. So as the rocket's about to blow and they're supposed to get to liftoff, the bomb goes into about 54 seconds left to go, or a minute, and there's a bunch of so Lois, you know, tries to put matters into her own hands,
and she opens the door to the wires to cut the wires, but there's a million wires there. And as she cuts the wire, the spacecraft starts to lift off. Yeah, the bomb's about to blow up in 30 seconds. And there's something that's gone wrong. And Clark kind of sees it and knows that something's up. So he dashes from the kid farm back to this space. So Clark, first time in his suit, ends up flying straight to the space station to rescue the astronauts. And there's people. I love how there's people with American flags, and they're all sitting out watching the um, watching the space about to watch the spacecraft take flight, and they're all drinking beer and going. And one guy notices something and says, "What the hell is that?" And you have the classic, "Is it a bird? Is it a plane?" No, it's a guy in a pair of tights and capes. And they all make fun of him and start throwing stuff at him. He gets up to the space station and finds Lois Lane, and with the bomb, he looks at the bomb with only 18 seconds to go. He grabs it and eats the bomb and just belches it out. So, I mean, that's kind of the cleverness of, Superman, where the superhero with the bomb and the bomb, he belches it out. So that kind of works. And Lois is kind of in shock that he did that. And then we get into part B, where the astronauts are getting off the spacecraft, and they all look at Superman with, and it's Mrs. Platt is with her daughter Amy as they're getting off the spacecraft. And Lois is all hysterical, like he did it, he saved it. And there's this nice moment where he gets Clark introduces himself, or Superman introduces himself to Amy, and Amy's like, "I like your costume," and he's like, "Thank you, my mother made it." And she's like, "Are you going to teach me how to fly?" And I love this moment because Superman says, "I might not teach you how to fly, but I'm going to teach you how to walk." And that's going to be possible. And then we find out that the mission has been scrubbed. And then they hear over the intercom that the space station has been scrubbed. The space project has been scrubbed, and they're all been out of shape for the fact that it's not going to be scrubbed. But Superman says, "I can help," and Lois is like, "Well, how can you?" And he says, "Simple. I'll give him a boost." And he walks out of the terminal. So Clark does the big grabs the spacecraft and boosts them up to get enough power to get up to give them liftoff into space. And it's a pretty cool scene. I mean, I can tell that it's still 90s, but to kind of see Superman do to lift up the space station all the way up into the space was pretty kind of cool to see this Superman do it. And I mean the CGI isn't great, but it works pretty good. And then this is really where the world knows more about Superman because we finally see from all over the world newspaper headlines that say "Sista Magnifico" and from like from France to the British paper saying mysterious phenomenon in space and alien invasions on Earth. And then one of them was the fictional National Enquirer. Like, I'm having the aliens baby, and I like how it's sort of, they have a fictional National Enquirer, which was pretty funny. So then back at the Daily Planet, Perry White is looking over you know, the stories of Superman that there's a man out there that can fly. And I like how Jimmy says to Perry that did you have you seen him on TV? He says, "Don't watch everything you believe on TV." And Perry thinks it's a big hoax, and then all of a sudden he looks up and he sees Superman carrying Lois Lane back to the Daily Planet, and I like what Perry White says. He says, "Great shades of Elvis." Um, and I think that's what this show kind of does, is really shows more of the relationship between the characters than really Superman and Lex Luthor and Lois Lane. And there's kind of a moment where we see throughout the window, Lois Lane is um, being um, swept in by Superman in the front door, in the window of the Daily Planet, and Cat Grant looks around and says, "I don't believe it." And one of the persons says, "What? That a man can fly?" "No, that Lois Lane has finally found someone who literally swept her off her feet." And she says, "Too bad he's an alien." And he's like, "Is that the rule? That I get a personal interview?" Then Clark or Superman flies off, and they all look amazed. Like, says, "Where? How will I find you?" And he says, "I'll be around," which is kind of a nice turn to the Christopher Reeves story. And we can, and I like what Kat says to Lois. She says, "Do you know what the S stands for?" Super. Superman. That's what we're gonna call him. And we think the episode's ending, except that Superman and Lex Luthor have to meet. So Superman is standing outside of Lex Luthor's house or balcony while and Lex sees him. And I like how Lex, really gives him the title, kind of really officially gives him the title where he says, "Astonishing debut, Superman. That's what they're calling you. It's international news." Superman tells Lex about Lex's plan, that how he's going to destroy Prometheus to put Lex's own space station in its place. And then that he will only get the patent for the disease. He would also be the supposed savior of the space program. And Lex is saying, "That's interesting news, but I'm afraid you're wrong." And Superman also tells Lex that you're also the
the person who's responsible for the death of 3 people, Commander Latterman, God, Samuel Pratt, and Dr. Baines. Those probably aren't the only ones. So you become both my judge and executioner. And so Lex is saying, so you become my judge and executioner. And Superman says, I have to uphold the law and that I'm not above. And Superman tells Lex Luthor that there will come a day that I can't wait for you to be dethroned and put behind bars, and I will tell you this day will come. So this is the moment where I think this version of Lex and Superman meet for the first time, and they kind of cut out their, basically what makes them Superman and Lex Luthor. And this is where this version of Superman and Lex Luthor kind of start their, okay, now we're going to start our rivalry between one another. And he's like, well, then let the games begin. And Superman flies off, saying, all you have to do if you need to find me is just to look up in the sky. And he flies off. Superman, or back at the Daily Planet, Clark comes back and talks to Lois, and Lois blushes over the fact that she just got to nail down an exclusive interview with Superman. And Clark's like, congratulations. And she starts gushing over how Superman, how and Clark says he seems to make that he made a pretty good impression of you on you. And she asks if Clark should be jealous, and Clark says, well, should I be? And he says, probably not. And as they walk out to the Daily Planet to cover a story about a shootout, she says, I'll ask the questions. And they get in the elevator, and that's the episode. So that's the first episode of of Superman, Lois and Clark, the New Adventures of Superman. I thought it was a pretty decent episode. There's a lot going on. I think they had to cover Superman coming into the daily, coming into the Metropolis area. They have to establish Lex Luthor. They have sort of a plot A, plot. They got a plot A and plot B. It was a pretty good episode. I thought it had. I thought the chemistry between Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher is really great. They have a strong relationship. I feel like this is a pretty good Superman. I mean, it does feel like a Superman soap show in a way, and I thought it worked pretty good. So I'll give it a B plus. Let me know what your thoughts are on this show. Did you like it? Did you watch it? And comment below what other shows you would like me to cover. And as always, like and subscribe. Peace.